Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and as always, I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. Truly, I mean that, and so please continue to be well and take care. Today, I'd like to continue on with a video a day, wherein this month, October 2020, is a month where, in keeping with the Halloween season, I am trying to talk about a TV series or a film or other work a day that is in some way, in one form or another, connected to or has a spiritual link with this current season of Halloween. So it might be in terms of a horror bent to it. There might be some interesting imagery that is at play, or similar types of motifs or designs or other cinematic goings on that have some kind of link with this season. Today's selection is from a filmmaker who is one of my absolute favorite filmmakers. His works are quite brilliant and incredibly inventive, and they operate on bases and foundations that seem very simple and straightforward, but in fact they turn into these brilliant, warped, avant-garde visual extravaganzas that seem to be swirling almost out of nothing, but then turn into the infinite when it comes to the visual space and imagination. The name of this filmmaker is Takashi Ito, and I'm not sure if you are familiar with his works. If not, that's okay. But he has a pretty sizable filmography, and these are, generally speaking, short films. I think they can be safely described as being experimental works. The depth and creativity that are involved with each of his works are, simply put, out of this world. The kind of images that he is able to conjure up by using photography and light and stop motion and angles and different forms of camera movement that are, simply put, astounding. This combination of technique and visual flair and a sort of deep undertone, a deep meaning to these images, I think is quite unparalleled, which is the primary reason why I am a big fan of his works. He is perhaps well known for an early work that he did, which is called SPACY, SPACY, and I think that is an example of the type of imagery that he is trying to engender in his works. He uses these aspects of Japanese, let's say, Japanese society, or images that are very common in everyday Japanese living. And so, for instance, in SPACY, this work I mentioned, he uses the imagery of the auditorium or the gymnasium, which is actually a building or structure that is quite common in Japan. There are many sorts of buildings that have similar structures, and so that is something that I think many Japanese people would recognize. In his other works, he uses the city landscape, and he uses the interior of a house or an apartment. And oftentimes these structures have a very similar type of look and style, such that if we look at the inside of such an apartment, I think people who live in Japan can identify with that kind of imagery. And he does this too with seemingly everyday instances and sites to be found, say, parks and outside of buildings and city landscapes and streets. These are images that even now are incredibly directly recognizable to someone like myself, because I live in Tokyo. And so I can see these images that he uses, and I can immediately attach some kind of significance to them, because, as I say, I can recognize everyday objects and things that I can see outside of my window or as I'm walking in the city. However, Takashi Ito, he then takes these images and he manipulates them, and he turns them into these festivals of light and shadow and movement that it's just mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. And he seems to be trying to cut deep into the very essence of the image, perhaps really diving into or manipulating or playing around with ideas and notions of perception, and playing around with ideas and notions of the environment and what the perception of one's environment really means. And he uses light and images and photography that can be very lightning speed, can be electrifying, but can also have a somewhat chilling edge to them. And I think, therefore, a lot of his films are, simply put, just mind-blowingly creative and inventive and spectacular. This is the filmmaker Takashi Ito. Now, as I say, his works, I think, can be described as being experimental, maybe avant-garde works. They are, for the most part, short films, and so you can find them. For instance, I have this particular DVD from Japan, and it's I love this DVD. This is one of my favorite. It's called Takashi Ito Film Anthology. I think if one looks around online, perhaps one can find some of his works to watch. And as I say, they are, relatively speaking, short, and so you can find a lot of his works available to view. And if you are interested, please feel free to check his works out. Some of his works do involve a sort of flash kind of photography, and so sometimes they might be difficult to watch especially if one is very sensitive to flashes and quick rapid-fire succession type of animated movement. And so just please be wary if one is sensitive to that kind of movement. However, if you are okay with that kinetic energy style of filmmaking, then once again, I would strongly urge to take a look at the work of Takashi Ito. His name is here, Ito is his last name, Ito. So you can maybe look around and hopefully you can find some examples of his works. I think for purposes of, say, a discussion of films in October, I wouldn't necessarily call his works to be directly horror film related. So they aren't horror film experimental works per se. However, there is a lot of imagery that he employs and that he is able to conjure up with the magic of his cinema that I think can be said to be perhaps very ghost-like, enigmatic, the way that he used photography and the visage, the human face, and bolts of energy and light in seemingly simplistic terms, but yet they are extraordinarily creative. I think these can also be said to be in many ways perhaps linked to a sense of the uncanny, a sense of the macabre, and also a feeling of uneasiness that is also linked with the beautiful and the infinite and the universal. And so I think all of that is potentially there in a viewing of a lot of his works. If I could point to a couple of examples that might be in particular of relevance and interest. There's a short work from the early to mid-1980s called Ghost, which I think is very worth checking out. The way that he uses the human form and the way that he uses movement and capturing the image and light and the hallways and darkened corridors and pipes and ceilings and the air and the mist and the atmosphere is very telling and quite cryptic and very profound, I think. So this is the film Ghost. There's another film that he did called Grimm, which is also around the same period, the early to mid 1980s, which has a similar dynamic. And yet the approach and style is also quite distinct. So I would recommend that film as well if you're interested. But there are many others. He did one called Moon. There's another one called Zone. There's one called Thunder. There are many films like this. But in any event, I will just direct your attention to the works of Takashi Ito if you are interested. Bold, dynamic. Each work of his seems to be having a life of its own. In other words, his output is one where I think it can be safely said that each film is distinct, so they are completely different from what comes before and what comes after. So he has his own style that operates within that particular work, and then when he goes to another film, he seems to be operating on a completely different style. And I think that is quite indicative of a sort of boundless energy that Ito, the filmmaker and artist, has. So I'm a huge fan of his work, and as I say, it might not be directly relevant to a horror genre type of film, but still, I think Halloween as a season can yield a lot of works in terms of creativity, in terms of the examination of the uncanny and the absurd and the mysterious. And I think these notions are enveloped and wrapped in what I would call the boundless creative energy that is exhibited in each of Takashi Ito's films. And so with that, my friends, I would strongly recommend checking out some of his works if you are interested. As I say, in particular, maybe you can check out films like Grimm and Ghost if you're interested. I will leave the information about those and other leave titles of other works of his in the description box below. And so if you're interested, please check out his works. Again, this is the filmmaker, one of my absolute favorites, Takashi Ito. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, my dear friends. Stay safe, stay strong, and cheers.